Hi, I'm Julia. When the paramedics rushed my husband to the emergency room that Tuesday morning, everyone pointed their fingers at me. The woman who cooked his breakfast, the woman who handed him his coffee, the woman who, according to my sister, Michelle, had been slowly poisoning him for months. But what none of them knew was that the real poison wasn't in his system. It was in the lies my sister had been feeding him. And when Dr. Rebecca Martinez held up those lab results 3 weeks, later showing Michelle's fingerprints all over the evidence, the room went dead silent. So tell me, have you ever been accused of something so horrific by your own family that it nearly destroyed your life? Only to discover the person pointing the finger was the one holding the smoking gun. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I remember staring at the hospital ceiling tiles while David lay unconscious in the bed next to me, his face pale and his breathing shallow. The doctors had stabilized him, but the questions lingered like smoke in the air. Food poisoning, they said initially. Severe gastroenteritis. But then Michelle arrived with her tear-streaked mascara and her perfectly timed hysterics, clutching David's hand like she was the grieving widow instead of his sister-in-law. She'd always been the dramatic one in our family. Growing up in Riverside, Michelle was the golden child who could do no wrong, while I was the responsible older sister who cleaned up her messes. When we were teenagers, she'd sneak out to parties, and I'd cover for her. When she crashed Dad's car, I helped pay for the repairs with my part-time job money. When she dropped out of college, I was the one who convinced our parents to let her move back home. I thought that was just what sisters did for each other. I should have known better. The first time Michelle met David was at our engagement party, 2 years ago. I'd been so excited to introduce them, thinking my little sister would finally see me happy and settled with someone who truly loved me. David was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. Kind, patient, successful in his work as an architect, and completely devoted to building a life together. He had this way of making me feel seen and valued that I'd never experienced before. But from the moment Michelle walked into that restaurant and saw David pull out my chair, something shifted in her expression. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but I caught it. The way her smile faltered for just a second when he kissed my cheek. The way her eyes narrowed when he mentioned the house we were planning to buy together. The way she lingered just a little too long when she hugged him goodbye. I told myself I was being paranoid. Michelle had always been competitive, but this was different. This was my happiness, my future, and surely she wouldn't begrudge me that. I was wrong. The subtle sabotage started small. Michelle would call David during our date nights with some manufactured emergency that always seemed to resolve itself by the time he arrived to help. She'd show up unannounced at our apartment, claiming she needed to talk to me about family drama, but somehow always ending up in long conversations with David about his work, his dreams, his fears. She had this way of making herself seem vulnerable and in need of protection that brought out every man's protective instincts. I watched it happening but convinced myself I was overreacting. David was just being kind to my sister. He was naturally helpful and caring, and Michelle was going through a rough patch after her latest breakup. Of course, he'd want to be supportive. When I tried to bring up my concerns, David would give me that patient smile and remind me that family was important, that Michelle was just struggling and needed our support. The morning David collapsed was like any other Tuesday. I'd woken up early to make his favorite breakfast. Scrambled eggs with fresh herbs from our little garden, whole wheat toast, and a large cup of coffee with just a splash of cream. It was our routine. I loved those quiet morning moments together before he left for work and I headed to my job at the local library. Simple, domestic, peaceful. David had been feeling under the weather for a few weeks. Nothing dramatic. Just fatigue and occasional stomach upset that he attributed to stress from a big project at work. I'd been encouraging him to see a doctor, but he kept putting it off, insisting it would pass once his deadline was met. Men and their stubborn pride, I'd tease him. But privately, I was getting worried. That morning, he took a few bites of his eggs and a sip of his coffee before doubling. Over in pain, the cup crashed to the floor, coffee spreading across our kitchen tiles like a dark omen. David's face went white, then green, and then he was on the floor, convulsing. I'd never seen anything so terrifying in my life. I called 911 with shaking fingers while trying to keep David conscious. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours. They loaded him onto a stretcher and asked me rapid-fire questions about what he'd eaten, what medications he was taking, whether he had any known allergies. I answered everything as best I could, my mind racing through every possibility. At the hospital, the emergency room doctor was kind but thorough. Dr. Williams, a middle-aged man with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, explained that David's symptoms suggested severe food poisoning or possibly exposure to some kind of toxin. They were running tests and had given him IV fluids and anti-nausea medication. He was stable, but would need to stay for observation. I called our families from the hospital waiting room. Mom and Dad arrived first, both of them looking worried and confused. Dad immediately started asking practical questions about David's insurance and whether I needed help with anything, while Mom wrapped me in one of her fierce hugs that somehow made everything feel slightly less terrifying. Michelle arrived 30 minutes later, and her entrance was nothing short of theatrical. She burst through the waiting room doors like she was auditioning for a soap opera, her eyes wide with what looked like carefully practiced shock. She rushed to me with her arms outstretched, but instead of the comfort I expected, her first words chilled me to the bone. "Oh my God, Julia, what did you do?" she whispered, but loud enough for our parents to hear. "I told David this might happen. I warned him, but he wouldn't listen." I pulled back from her embrace, confused and hurt. "What are you talking about? What did you tell David?" Michelle's eyes filled with tears that seemed to appear on command. "The things you've been saying about him lately, about how tired you were of taking care of him when he was sick, about how you wished things could go back to the way they were before you got married. I tried to tell him it was probably just stress talking, but when he told me he'd been feeling sick for weeks." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had never said any of those things. I adored David, and yes, I'd been concerned about his health, but I'd never expressed anything but love and worry. The idea that Michelle would twist my concern into something sinister was so shocking that I couldn't immediately respond. Dad stepped forward, his face creased with confusion. "Michelle, what exactly are you saying?" Michelle dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she'd apparently had ready. "I'm probably wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But David called me yesterday, worried because Julia had been acting strange lately, secretive, and with his symptoms getting worse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She let the implication hang in the air like poison gas. Mom's hand fell away from my shoulder. "Julia, honey, you need to tell us exactly what happened this morning." The betrayal was so complete, so unexpected, that I felt like I was drowning. In the middle of what should have been my safe harbor, my own sister was planting seeds of doubt about me in my husband's mind and in my parents' hearts. And she was doing it while David lay unconscious, unable to defend me or clarify what he'd actually said to her. "I made him breakfast like I do every morning," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. "Eggs, toast, coffee, the same things I've been making for 2 years, the same things I eat myself." "But you didn't eat with him this morning, did you?" Michelle's question was delivered with the precision of a prosecutor. "David mentioned that you'd been skipping breakfast lately, that you'd been saying you weren't hungry in the mornings." It was true that I'd been eating less in the mornings, but only because I'd been worried about David and my appetite had suffered. The way Michelle presented it, though, made it sound calculating and suspicious. Every innocent detail of my life was being twisted into evidence of guilt for a crime I'd never committed. Dr. Williams appeared in the waiting room doorway, and we all turned toward him with desperate anticipation. "Mrs. Patterson, your husband, is awake and asking for you. His condition has stabilized, and while we're still running tests, I think he's going to be fine." Relief flooded through me so powerfully that my knees nearly buckled. David was okay. Whatever this was, whatever was happening, David was okay. I started toward the doctor, but Michelle's hand caught my arm. "Doctor, before she goes in there, there's something you should know," Michelle said, her voice trembling with what sounded like reluctance. "We're concerned that David might have been, that someone might have." She couldn't seem to finish the sentence, which only made it more damning. Dr. Williams looked between Michelle and me, his expression growing more serious. "Are you suggesting this wasn't accidental food poisoning?" Dad cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Doctor, we're just worried. My daughter, Julia, has been under a lot of stress lately, and David has been sick on and off for weeks. Michelle here thinks there might be more to it." The room seemed to tilt sideways. My own father was standing in a hospital waiting room, essentially telling a doctor that he suspected me of poisoning my husband, the man I loved more than anything in the world, the man I'd been frantically worried about for weeks, encouraging to see a doctor, trying to take care of. "I understand your concerns," Dr. Williams said carefully. "We'll be running a full toxicology panel as part of our standard protocol for cases like this. If there's anything unusual in Mr. Patterson's system, we'll find it." Michelle squeezed my arm, and to anyone watching, it probably looked like sisterly comfort. But her grip was too tight, and her whispered words were anything but comforting. "I really hope I'm wrong about this, Julia. For everyone's sake." I jerked my arm away from her and looked her straight in the eye. For just a moment, her mask slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating in her expression that made my blood run cold. Then the concerned sister act was back in place, and she was dabbing at her eyes again. "Can I see my husband now?" I asked Dr. Williams, proud that my voice didn't shake. "Of course. But Mrs. Patterson, given the concerns that have been raised, I do need to ask you to limit your visit to 15 minutes for now, just until we have more information." I nodded, understanding that I was now under suspicion in my husband's medical care. My sister had accomplished in one afternoon what I would have thought impossible. She'd turned my family against me and made me a suspect in my own marriage. David looked small and pale in the hospital bed, hooked up to an IV and various monitors, but his eyes brightened when he saw me, and he reached for my hand with the arm that wasn't connected to medical equipment. "Hey, beautiful," he said, his voice hoarse but warm. "Quite a morning, huh?" I wanted to throw myself into his arms and sob out all the fear and confusion and betrayal I was feeling. Instead, I sat carefully in the chair next to his bed and took his hand gently. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck, but better than I did this morning. The doctor says it was probably something I ate, but I can't figure out what. We ate the same things yesterday, didn't we?" The innocent question felt like another piece of evidence against me. "Not exactly the same. You had that leftover pizza for lunch while I had a salad. And you stopped for coffee on your way home from work." David frowned, trying to remember. "Right, the coffee from that new place downtown. Maybe that was it. Or maybe I'm just run down and caught some kind of bug." I wanted to tell him about Michelle's accusations, about the suspicion that was already spreading through our families like wildfire. But he looked so tired and vulnerable that I couldn't bring myself to add that burden to his recovery. Besides, what if Dr. Williams was right to be cautious? What if there was more to David's illness than random food poisoning? "David, have you talked to Michelle lately? About us, I mean." His expression grew confused. Michelle. Yeah, she's called a few times when you were at work. She seemed worried about you, actually. Said you'd been stressed and not yourself lately. I told her we were fine, that you were just concerned about my health. My heart sank. Michelle had been working on David for weeks, carefully planting seeds of doubt and concern. Not enough to make him suspicious of me directly, but enough to make him question my behavior and state of mind. When this morning's crisis hit, she'd been perfectly positioned to direct the suspicion exactly where she wanted it. What exactly did she say about me being stressed? David shifted uncomfortably in the bed. Nothing specific, just that you seemed different lately, more withdrawn. She asked if we were having problems at home, if maybe the pressure of being married was getting to you. He squeezed my hand. I told her she was imagining things, that you were perfect and I was the luckiest man alive. But now, with this happening... Julia, is there something you're not telling me? Are you okay? The careful concern in his voice broke my heart. Michelle had done her work well. She'd made my husband question my mental state and my behavior, without ever directly accusing me of anything. Now, in his vulnerable state after a medical emergency, those seeds of doubt were blooming into full suspicion. I'm fine, David. I'm worried about you, and I've been stressed because you've been sick, but I'm fine. I would never hurt you. You know that, right? He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, I could feel our entire relationship shifting. Of course I know that. You're my wife. I love you. It's just, this whole thing is scary, and I don't understand what's happening. Neither did I, but I was beginning to suspect that Michelle understood perfectly. The question was why. What did she gain by destroying my marriage and turning my family against me? What could possibly be worth this level of calculated cruelty? A soft knock on the door interrupted my thoughts, and a nurse peeked in. Mrs. Patterson? I'm sorry, but visiting hours are over for now. Mr. Patterson needs to rest, and the doctor wants to run a few more tests. I kissed David's forehead and promised to be back first thing in the morning. He smiled at me, but there was something different in his eyes. A distance that hadn't been there that morning when we'd shared breakfast in our sunny kitchen. In the hallway, my family was waiting. Michelle had composed herself and now looked like the picture of concerned support. Mom was clutching her purse like a lifeline, and Dad was staring at the floor with the expression he got when he was trying to solve a particularly complex problem. How is he? Mom asked immediately. Better. Tired, but better. The doctor wants to run more tests, but he thinks David will be fine. That's wonderful news, Michelle said, and her relief sounded genuine. I've been praying everything would be okay. Dad cleared his throat. Julia, we need to talk, as a family. There are some things that need to be discussed. I looked at the three people who should have been my strongest supporters and saw doubt in every face. Michelle had accomplished something I would have thought impossible. In the space of a few hours, she'd made my own parents question whether I was capable of poisoning my husband. Not here, I said quietly. David doesn't need to overhear family drama while he's trying to recover. We drove separately to my parents' house, the same house where Michelle and I had grown up, where we'd shared bedrooms and secrets and dreams for the future. Now it felt like enemy territory. Mom made coffee that nobody touched, and we sat around the kitchen table like we were conducting a business meeting instead of having a family discussion. Dad started the conversation with the direct approach that had served him well in his career as an accountant. Michelle has shared some concerns about your state of mind lately, Julia. We're not accusing you of anything, but we need to understand what's been going on. What exactly has Michelle told you? Michelle leaned forward with perfect sisterly concern. Julia, I love you and I'm worried about you. You've seemed different lately, distant, angry, and some of the things you've said about David. What things? Give me one specific example of something I said about David that worried you. Michelle's eyes filled with tears again. It was remarkable how quickly she could summon them. Last month, when David was sick with that stomach bug, you called me crying. You said you felt trapped, that you weren't sure marriage was what you'd thought it would be. You said taking care of him when he was sick made you feel like his mother, instead of his wife, and you resented it. It was a masterful lie because it contained just enough truth to be believable. I had called Michelle when David was sick, and I had been frustrated and tired from taking care of him while working full-time. But I'd never said I felt trapped or that I resented him. I'd expressed normal caregiver fatigue to my sister, expecting understanding and support. Instead, she'd filed it away to use against me later. That's not what I said, Michelle, and you know it. Then what did you say? Dad asked quietly. I tried to remember the exact conversation, but it had been weeks ago and I'd been exhausted and emotional. I was tired. David had been sick for several days, and I was trying to take care of him while keeping up with everything else. I might have vented about being stressed, but I never said anything about feeling trapped or resenting him. Mom reached across the table and took my hand. Honey, maybe you don't remember exactly what you said. You were upset and tired. The implication was clear. My own mother was suggesting that I might have said terrible things about my husband and simply forgotten about it. Michelle had poisoned that well too, making everyone question not just my intentions, but my memory and mental stability. I remember perfectly well, Mom. I love David. I've been worried sick about his health for weeks. The idea that I would hurt him is insane. Nobody's saying you hurt him intentionally, Michelle said softly. But sometimes when people are under stress, they do things they wouldn't normally do. Sometimes they don't even realize they're doing them. It was brilliant, really. Michelle was suggesting that I might be poisoning David subconsciously, which would explain why I genuinely seemed shocked and confused by the accusation. It was the perfect crime because it didn't require me to be actively malicious, just mentally unstable enough to be dangerous without knowing it. Dad sat back in his chair, looking older than I'd ever seen him. Julia, I think you should stay here tonight. Give yourself some space to think, and give David some space to recover. I'm not leaving my husband alone in the hospital because my sister has convinced you I'm dangerous. It's just for tonight, Mom said quickly. Until we know more about what made David sick. I looked around the table at the three people who had shaped my entire life, who had taught me about love and loyalty and family bonds. They were asking me to exile myself from my own marriage based on lies and manipulation. And they were doing it for my own good, which somehow made it even worse. Fine, I said, standing up from the table. I'll stay tonight. But I want everyone to remember this conversation when the truth comes out. I want you to remember that you chose to believe Michelle's lies over my word. Michelle's perfect mask slipped again, just for a second, and I saw satisfaction flash across her face. She was winning, and she knew it. Whatever game she was playing, she was several moves ahead of the rest of us. I spent that night in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how my life had been turned upside down in a single day. The glow-in-the-dark stars Michelle and I had stuck up there when we were kids were still visible, faded but persistent. I remembered the night we'd put them up, how we'd planned out constellations and made up stories about space adventures we'd have together when we grew up. When had Michelle started hating me? When had I become her enemy instead of her sister? And more importantly, what was she really after? Destroying my marriage seemed like such a disproportionate response to normal sibling rivalry. There had to be something more, some deeper motivation I wasn't seeing. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a hopeful moment, I thought it might be David, but it was from Michelle. I'm sorry about tonight. I know this is hard, but I really am worried about you. Maybe you should talk to someone professional about the stress you've been under. I love you, sis. I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without responding. Michelle was still playing her game, still positioning herself as the loving sister who was just concerned about my well-being. But I'd seen her mask slip twice now, and I knew what was underneath. The next morning, I drove straight to the hospital, determined to be there when David woke up. I needed to talk to him before Michelle had another chance to whisper poison in his ear. But when I arrived at his room, I found it empty except for a nurse changing the sheets. "Excuse me, where is my husband? David Patterson?" The nurse looked up with a sympathetic expression. "Oh, Mrs. Patterson. Mr. Patterson was discharged early this morning. His sister picked him up about an hour ago." My heart stopped. His sister? Yes, a lovely young woman. Michelle, I think. She said you were at work and asked her to bring him home. David didn't have a sister. Michelle was my sister, not his. But she'd walked into that hospital and claimed him like he belonged to her family instead of mine. And David, still weak and confused from his ordeal, had apparently gone with her without question. I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind racing through possibilities. Michelle had David alone somewhere, and he was still vulnerable and uncertain about what had happened to him. Whatever she'd been planning, this was her opportunity to complete it. Our house was empty when I arrived. David's overnight bag was gone from the bedroom, along with some of his clothes. It looked like he'd packed for an extended stay somewhere else. My husband had moved out without even talking to me, and my sister had helped him do it. I called David's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried Michelle's number and got the same result. It was like they'd both disappeared, leaving me alone in the house we'd bought together, surrounded by the life we'd built that was now crumbling around me. That afternoon, Dr. Williams called with David's test results. His tone was professional, but concerned, and I could hear the subtext beneath his words. "Mrs. Patterson, we found traces of several substances in your husband's blood work that are consistent with gradual poisoning over a period of weeks. Small amounts of arsenic and other heavy metals that would cause the symptoms he's been experiencing." The room spun around me. Someone really had been poisoning David, slowly and deliberately, causing his weeks of illness that we'd attributed to stress and overwork. And Michelle had made sure that everyone would suspect me when the truth finally came to light. "Doctor, I need you to understand something. I did not poison my husband. I love him more than anything, and I would never hurt him." "Mrs. Patterson, I have to ask you to come in for questioning. The police are involved now, and there are procedures that need to be followed." I hung up the phone and sat in my empty house, finally understanding the full scope of Michelle's plan. She hadn't just been trying to break up my marriage or turn my family against me. She'd been systematically poisoning David while positioning me to take the blame. And when the medical evidence came to light, I would be the obvious suspect. But Michelle had made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that I would crumble under the pressure, that I would accept the role of villain she'd written for me. She didn't. Know that beneath my quiet exterior lay the same stubborn determination that had gotten me through college on scholarships, that had helped me build a career and a marriage, despite coming from a family that didn't always believe in me. I wasn't going to run, and I wasn't going to hide. I was going to fight back, and I was going to prove my innocence. Michelle had started this war, but I was going to finish it. The question was how. How do you prove a negative? How do you demonstrate that you didn't do something when all the evidence points to you? And how do you expose a sister who had spent months carefully constructing the perfect frame? I needed help, and I needed it from someone who would believe in my innocence even when the evidence suggested otherwise. Someone who could see through Michelle's lies and manipulation to the truth underneath. But as I sat alone in my house that evening, waiting for the police to come question me about poisoning my own husband, I had no idea where that help would come from. The police station smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. Detective Rodriguez was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes that had seen too much, and she handled my interrogation with professional courtesy that barely masked her suspicion. I sat across from her in a sterile room with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look guilty, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. "Mrs. Patterson, walk me through your morning routine with your husband," she said, her pen poised over a notepad. Every detail, no matter how small. I'd already told this story 3 times to 3 different people, but I repeated it again with the same careful precision. The eggs, the toast, the coffee with cream, the garden herbs I'd picked fresh that morning, the way David had smiled at me over his breakfast before doubling over in agony. "And you prepared all of this food yourself?" "Yes, I've been making David's breakfast every morning for 2 years. It's one of our traditions." Detective Rodriguez made a note. "Your sister Michelle mentioned that you'd been acting differently lately, withdrawn, stressed, making comments about your marriage. Can you elaborate on that?" I felt the familiar surge of anger that came every time someone repeated Michelle's carefully crafted lies. My sister has mischaracterized normal concerns about my husband's health as something sinister. David had been feeling unwell for weeks. Of course, I was stressed and worried. "But you didn't suggest he see a doctor?" "I suggested it multiple times. David kept saying it would pass, that it was just work stress." The detective's expression didn't change, but I could see her filing away every detail, every inconsistency that Michelle had helped create. How do you prove that someone is lying when their lies are woven so skillfully around threads of truth? "Mrs. Patterson, the toxicology results show that your husband has been ingesting small amounts of arsenic and other heavy metals over several weeks. These substances would cause exactly the symptoms he's been experiencing. Do you have any idea how these substances might have entered his system?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. I knew what she was really asking. Did I poison my husband slowly, methodically, while pretending to be the concerned wife? Did I watch him suffer while maintaining my performance of innocence? "Detective Rodriguez, I understand how this looks. I understand that the wife is always the first suspect when something happens to the husband. But I need you to understand something. I love David more than my own life. The idea that I would hurt him, let alone slowly poison him over weeks, is not just wrong. It's impossible." Impossible is a strong word, Mrs. Patterson. People do impossible things every day. Then investigate the impossible. Look at who else had access to David's food, his drinks, his environment. Look at who has been filling his head with doubts about me. Look at my sister. Detective Rodriguez set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "Are you suggesting that your sister poisoned your husband and framed you for it?" "I'm suggesting that you investigate all possibilities instead of just the obvious one." The detective studied my face for a long moment. "Mrs. Patterson, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen wives who killed their husbands and cried real tears at their funerals. I've seen sisters who destroyed each other over men, money, and things that seem trivial to everyone else. What I haven't seen is evidence that points in any direction other than toward you." I left the police station feeling like I was drowning in quicksand. Every movement I made to save myself only pulled me deeper into Michelle's trap. David still wouldn't take my calls, and when I drove by Michelle's apartment, his car was parked outside. My husband was living with my sister while the police built their case against me. That evening, I sat in my empty house trying to think, like Michelle, what was her endgame? If she succeeded in having me arrested for attempted murder, what did she gain? David would be free, but he'd also be traumatized and suspicious of everyone. The family would be torn apart. Michelle would have destroyed everything and everyone in the pursuit of what exactly? My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. desperate for any contact with the outside world. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the County Forensic Laboratory. I've been reviewing your husband's toxicology results, and I was wondering if we could meet." I gripped the phone tighter. "Are you working with the police?" "I work with everyone who needs answers. Mrs. Patterson, there are some inconsistencies in these results that I'd like to discuss with you. Would you be available to meet tomorrow morning?" A forensic expert wanted to meet with me about inconsistencies in the evidence against me. It was the first ray of hope I'd felt since this nightmare began. "Yes, of course. Where and when?" "My office at the county lab, 9 a.m. And Mrs. Patterson, come alone and don't mention this meeting to anyone else. Yet." Dr. Martinez's office was nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of the sterile, intimidating laboratory I'd imagined, it was warm and cluttered, filled with plants and books and family photos. Dr. Martinez herself was a small woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and intelligent dark eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing for me to sit in a comfortable chair across from her desk. "I know this situation must be incredibly difficult for you. Dr. Martinez, I need you to know that I didn't poison my husband. I know how that sounds. I know what the evidence suggests, but I'm telling you the truth." She nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Patterson, I've been doing forensic toxicology for 20 years. I've analyzed blood samples from hundreds of poisoning cases, both accidental and intentional. Your husband's results troubled me from the moment I saw them." She pulled out a thick file and opened it to reveal charts and graphs that meant nothing to me. "The pattern of substances in your husband's blood is unusual. Arsenic, lead, mercury, cadmium. All in small amounts, all consistent with chronic low-level exposure. But the combination and the ratios are what caught my attention." "What do you mean?" "Someone who was systematically poisoning a person would typically use one substance. Maybe two. It's easier to control, easier to predict the effects. What I'm seeing here looks more like exposure to multiple contaminated sources." My heart began to race. "Are you saying David wasn't being poisoned intentionally?" "I'm saying the evidence suggests something more complex than simple homicidal poisoning. Mrs. Patterson, tell me about your daily routines. What did you and your husband eat and drink regularly?" I described our habits in detail. The coffee from the local shop, the water from our home filtration system, the organic vegetables from the farmer's market, David's protein shakes after his workouts, the vitamins we both took every morning. Dr. Martinez made notes as I talked, occasionally asking for clarification. When I finished, she sat back and studied her papers. "Mrs. Patterson, I'd like to test some things from your home. The coffee, the water system, anything that your husband consumed regularly. Would you be willing to allow that?" "Of course. Anything that might help." "There's something else. The timeline of the poisoning doesn't quite match what I'd expect if you were the perpetrator. The levels suggest exposure that began about 6 weeks ago and gradually increased. Can you think of anything that changed in your husband's routine around that time?" I thought back 6 weeks, trying to remember any changes in our lives. David had been working on a big project, but that had been going on for months. We hadn't traveled anywhere new or tried any new restaurants. The only change I could think of was Michelle started coming around more often, I said slowly. She was going through a breakup and needed family support. She'd been bringing David homemade meals when I was working late, trying to help out. Dr. Martinez's pen stopped moving. "Your sister was bringing your husband food?" "Yes, but surely you don't think." "Michelle loves David like a brother. She wouldn't hurt him." "Mrs. Patterson, in cases like this, we have to consider all possibilities. Who else knew about your husband's symptoms? Who else had the opportunity to introduce toxins into his diet?" The pieces of the puzzle were starting to shift into a different pattern, one that made my stomach turn. Michelle had been positioning herself as David's caregiver and protector while slowly making him sick. She'd been creating the very problem she claimed to be worried about. Dr. Martinez, what exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything yet, but I am going to test everything, and I mean everything, that your husband has been consuming. And Mrs. Patterson, I want you to be very careful. If someone has been poisoning your husband and setting you up to take the blame, you could be in danger too. I drove home with my mind reeling. The possibility that Michelle had been poisoning David while pretending to care for him was so monstrous that I could barely process it. But it explained everything. Her sudden concern for David's health, her frequent visits to our house, her carefully planted seeds of doubt about my mental state and behavior. She'd been playing a long game, slowly, making David sick while positioning herself as his protector and me as his threat. When the poisoning was finally discovered, all the evidence would point to me while she appeared to be the innocent sister who'd tried to warn everyone. That afternoon, Dr. Martinez called me back. Mrs. Patterson, I need you to come back to the lab immediately. And this time, I want you to bring Detective Rodriguez with you. An hour later, I sat in Dr. Martinez's office again, this time with Detective Rodriguez beside me. The detective looked skeptical and impatient, like she was humoring a crazy woman and a meddling scientist. Dr. Martinez, I appreciate your thoroughness, but we have a clear case here, Detective Rodriguez said. The victim's wife had means, motive, and opportunity. The physical evidence supports the charges. Detective, the physical evidence supports poisoning, but it doesn't necessarily support the conclusion about who did the poisoning. Dr. Martinez spread several test results across her desk. I've analyzed samples from the Patterson household, the coffee, the water, the vitamins, the food from their refrigerator. All clean. Detective Rodriguez frowned. Then how was the husband being poisoned? That's where it gets interesting. Dr. Martinez pulled out another set of results. Mrs. Patterson, you mentioned that your sister had been bringing meals for your husband. Do you happen to have any leftover containers or utensils that she used? I thought for a moment. There might be some containers in our dishwasher. Michelle always brought food in these glass containers with matching lids. I'd like to test those containers. And, Detective, I'd like to test anything else that the sister provided to the household. Detective Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. Dr. Martinez, are you telling me that you think the sister poisoned the husband and framed the wife? I'm telling you that the evidence doesn't support the current theory of the case. And I'm telling you that if you arrest Mrs. Patterson based on what we have now, you might be letting the real perpetrator walk free. The detective looked at me with new eyes, and I could see her mental gears shifting. Mrs. Patterson, I need you to think very carefully. Has your sister ever done anything before that made you question her motives or her honesty? The floodgates opened. I told them about Michelle's history of manipulation and drama, about her competitive relationship with me, about the way she'd inserted herself into my marriage from the very beginning, about the lies she'd told our parents and David about my supposed confessions of marital dissatisfaction. She's been planning this for months, I realized as I spoke. Every conversation, every visit, every concerned phone call was laying the groundwork for this moment. She knew that when David got sick enough to require medical attention, I'd be the obvious suspect. Detective Rodriguez was taking notes furiously now. Mrs. Patterson, where is your sister now? At her apartment with my husband. She convinced him to stay with her while I'm under suspicion. Dr. Martinez, how quickly can you get results on those containers? If they contain what I think they contain, very quickly. Give me 12 hours. Detective Rodriguez stood up. Mrs. Patterson, I want you to go home and act normal. Don't contact your husband or your sister. Don't let on that we've had this conversation. Can you do that? I nodded. though the idea of acting normal when my entire life was collapsing seemed impossible. That night, I lay awake in my empty bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about my sister. How long had she been planning this? Had she always hated me this much? Or had something specific triggered her desire to destroy my life? And what was she planning to do with David once I was out of the picture? The next morning, Dr. Martinez called at exactly 9 a.m. "Mrs. Patterson, can you come to the lab? And please ask Detective Rodriguez to meet us here." Her voice was grim, and I knew she'd found something. Within an hour, the three of us were seated around Dr. Martinez's desk again, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. The glass containers tested positive for multiple heavy metals, Dr. Martinez announced without preamble. Arsenic, lead, mercury, cadmium. All in concentrations that would be virtually undetectable in food, but would accumulate in the body over time with repeated exposure. Detective Rodriguez leaned forward. "You're saying the sister was serving poisoned food in poisoned containers? I'm saying someone prepared these containers specifically to deliver toxins slowly and undetectably. This wasn't accidental contamination. This was deliberate, calculated poisoning designed to mimic chronic low-level exposure to environmental toxins." My hands were shaking. Michelle hadn't just been trying to frame me for poisoning David. She'd been actually poisoning him while making it look like an accident or environmental exposure. If her plan had worked, David would have continued to get sicker while everyone suspected me of slowly murdering him. "Dr. Martinez, is there any way to prove that Michelle contaminated those containers?" "That's where we get into forensic evidence. Mrs. Patterson, you mentioned that your sister always washed the containers before returning them to you?" "Yes, she was very particular about that. She said she didn't want to leave me with dirty dishes to clean." Dr. Martinez smiled grimly. What she was actually doing was trying to eliminate fingerprint evidence. But she wasn't quite thorough. "Enough." She pulled out a magnifying glass and showed us one of the container lids. "There are partial prints on the inside rim of this lid, in an area that would be very difficult to clean thoroughly. If we can match these prints to your sister, we'll have physical evidence that she handled these containers in a way consistent with contaminating them." Detective Rodriguez was already reaching for her phone. "I'm calling for a warrant to collect fingerprints from Michelle Patterson. And I want a team at her apartment to bring in both her and the husband for questioning." As the detective made her calls, Dr. Martinez turned to me with a serious expression. "Mrs. Patterson, I need you to understand something. Your sister isn't just malicious. She's incredibly intelligent and calculating. This was a sophisticated poisoning scheme that could have continued for months without detection. If your husband hadn't gotten sick enough to require emergency medical care, she might have succeeded in slowly killing him while making you look like the perpetrator." The full horror of what Michelle had attempted hit me like a physical blow. She hadn't just been trying to break up my marriage or even frame me for attempted murder. She'd been willing to kill David to achieve her goals. My sister, the person I'd protected and supported my entire life, had tried to murder my husband. Dr. Martinez, why? What could she possibly gain from all this? That's a question for Detective Rodriguez and the psychologists. But Mrs. Patterson, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that your sister's motives might not make sense to anyone but her. Some people destroy others simply because they can't bear to see them happy. Detective Rodriguez finished her calls and turned. Back to us. "We're moving on this now. Mrs. Patterson, I need you to stay available, but stay away from your sister and your husband until we sort this out. If she realizes that we're on to her, she might do something desperate." I drove home through the suburban streets of Riverside, watching normal people go about their normal lives while my world continued to crumble and rebuild itself in impossible ways. Just 24 hours ago, I'd been the prime suspect in my husband's poisoning. Now I was the victim of an elaborate frame-up by my own sister, but David was still at Michelle's apartment, still believing her lies about me. Even when the truth came out, Even when Michelle was arrested and charged, would David be able to forgive me for what he'd been put through? Would our marriage survive the trauma of what Michelle had done to both of us? My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. It was Detective Rodriguez. "Mrs. Patterson, we have Michelle in custody. The fingerprint match was conclusive. She's been charged with attempted murder and evidence tampering." Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I had to sit in my car for several minutes before I felt steady enough to walk into my house. "What about David? How is he taking the news?" "He's processing. Mrs. Patterson, your husband has been through a significant trauma. He was poisoned by someone he trusted, and he was manipulated into doubting the person who loves him most. He's going to need time to work through all of this." "Can I see him?" "Not yet. He's still being medically evaluated to make sure there are no lasting effects from the poisoning." "But Mrs. Patterson?" "He asked me to tell you that he's sorry. He said he should have trusted you, and he's sorry he didn't." I sat in my empty house that evening, surrounded by the remnants of the life Michelle had tried to destroy. Tomorrow, David would come home, and we'd begin the long process of healing from what had been done to us. Michelle would face justice for her crimes, though I suspected no punishment would ever seem adequate for the magnitude of her betrayal. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, I could breathe freely. The truth was out, the nightmare was over, and the woman who had tried to poison my husband and frame me for the crime was behind bars where she belonged. I thought about Dr. Martinez, the forensic expert who had seen through Michelle's elaborate deception when everyone else was ready to accept the obvious explanation. She'd been the unexpected ally I'd needed, the professional who cared more about finding the truth than closing an easy case. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the person who saves you is someone you've never met before, someone who simply refuses to accept that the obvious answer is necessarily the right answer. Dr. Martinez had looked at the evidence with fresh eyes and seen the inconsistencies that everyone else had missed. As I prepared for bed in my own house for the first time in days, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this ordeal began. Hope. Not just hope that my marriage could be repaired and my relationship with David could be healed, but hope that justice would prevail and that the truth, no matter how complicated or unexpected, would always find a way to surface. Michelle had underestimated the power of forensic science and the dedication of professionals like Dr. Martinez. She'd assumed that her careful planning and manipulation would be enough to destroy me and cover her tracks. She'd been wrong, and now she would pay the price for her crimes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as David and I worked to rebuild our trust and our life together. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be sleeping in my own bed, cleared of all charges, and surrounded by the truth that had finally set me free. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath my feet as I emerged into the California sunshine, squinting against the brightness after hours spent in fluorescent-lit hallways. Michelle's arraignment had been swift and brutal. The judge had denied bail, citing the severity of the charges and the calculated nature of the crime. Attempted murder, evidence tampering, conspiracy. The words echoed in my mind as I walked toward my car, each one representing a piece of my sister's soul that I'd never truly known existed. David was waiting by my Honda, leaning against the passenger door with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. 3 days had passed since Michelle's arrest. 3 days of medical tests and police interviews and lawyers explaining the legal process that would determine my sister's fate. This was the first time David and I had been alone together since that terrible morning in our kitchen when everything fell apart. He looked fragile in a way I'd never seen before. The confident architect who could design entire buildings from scratch now seemed unsure of his place in the world. The poisoning had taken more than just his physical health. It had stolen his ability to trust his own perceptions, to believe in the safety of his own home and marriage. "How are you feeling?" I asked, though the question seemed inadequate, for everything we'd both endured. "Like I don't know anything anymore," he said quietly. Julia, I'm so sorry. I should have trusted you. I should have known that you could never hurt me. I wanted to tell him it was okay, that I understood why he doubted me when all the evidence pointed in my direction. But the truth was more complicated than forgiveness. The truth was that my husband had chosen to believe my sister's lies over my word, and that betrayal cut deeper than Michelle's poisoning scheme ever could. David, we need to talk. Really talk. Not here, but somewhere private where we can figure out how to move forward from this. He nodded, understanding the weight behind my words. Our marriage had survived Michelle's attempt to destroy it, but surviving wasn't the same as thriving. We had months of damage to undo, trust to rebuild, and questions to answer about how we'd let Michelle manipulate us so completely. We drove home in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The house felt different when we walked through the front door together. It was the same kitchen where David had collapsed, the same living room where I'd sat alone wondering if my life was over. But somehow the space felt foreign now. Michelle's presence lingered in every corner like smoke, a reminder of how thoroughly she'd invaded our sanctuary. I keep thinking about all the meals she brought, David said, settling onto the couch with careful movements. His body was still recovering from weeks of systematic poisoning. All those times she seemed so concerned. About my health? Asking about my symptoms? Suggesting remedies? She was creating the problem she pretended to be solving. I sat across from him in the armchair, maintaining distance while we navigated this fragile conversation. David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. When did you start doubting me? Not just this week, but before. When did Michelle's words start taking root? He was quiet for so long that I wondered if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. It was gradual. She'd make these little comments about how stressed you seemed, how worried she was about you handling the pressure of marriage. At first, I defended you completely. I told her she was imagining things, that you were perfect and I was lucky to have you. But then I started noticing things differently. When you'd have a bad day at work, I'd remember Michelle saying you seemed overwhelmed. When you'd get frustrated with household stuff, I'd think about her concerns about your state of mind. She never said anything directly critical about you. She just planted these seeds of doubt that grew every time something normal happened. The manipulation had been even more sophisticated than I'd realized. Michelle hadn't poisoned just David's body. She'd poisoned his perception of me, turning every ordinary moment of stress or frustration into evidence that something was wrong with our marriage. The worst part, David continued, is that she made me feel like I was protecting you by being suspicious. She convinced me that questioning your behavior was actually caring about your well-being. She said that if I really loved you, I'd get you help before you did something you'd regret. I felt sick thinking about how thoroughly Michelle had twisted David's love for me into a weapon against our relationship. She'd used his devotion to me as the very tool to drive us apart. David, I need you to understand something. What Michelle did to us wasn't just about poisoning or framing me for a crime. She attacked the foundation of our marriage. She made you doubt your ability to trust your own wife, and she made me question whether the person I loved most in the world would choose me when things got difficult. He looked up at me with eyes full of pain and regret. Julia, I know I failed you. I know I should have trusted you over her, but I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to prove to you that I'll never doubt you again. The vulnerability in his voice broke something open inside me. This was my husband, the man I'd chosen to build a life with, and he was as much a victim of Michelle's scheme as I was. Maybe more so, because he'd been slowly poisoned while being manipulated into believing the person he loved most was his enemy. David, I don't need you to prove anything, but I need us to figure out how this happened so it can never happen again. I need to understand how Michelle got so close to both of us that she could orchestrate something this elaborate. We spent the next several hours talking through everything that had led to this moment. David's growing health problems, Michelle's increasing presence in our lives, the subtle ways she'd positioned herself as the concerned sister while undermining my credibility with him and our families. What emerged was a picture of calculated manipulation that had begun almost from the moment David and I got engaged. Michelle had never accepted that I'd found happiness she couldn't touch, success she couldn't diminish, love she couldn't steal. So she'd set out to destroy all of it, and she'd nearly succeeded. "There's something else," David said as the afternoon. Light began to fade through our living room windows. "Something I need to tell you about Michelle, about why I think she did this." I braced myself for another revelation. How many more secrets were hiding in the wreckage of the past few months? A few weeks ago, before I got really sick, Michelle told me she'd always been in love with me. She said she'd fallen for me the night we met at your engagement party, and that she'd spent the last 2 years watching us together and knowing she could make me happier than you ever could. The words hit me like a physical blow. Michelle hadn't just been trying to destroy my marriage out of general jealousy or spite. She'd been trying to steal my husband. The poisoning, the frame-up, the elaborate manipulation of our families and friends, it had all been designed to remove me from David's life so she could take my place. She said that once you were gone, once everyone saw who you really were, I'd realized that she was the one who'd been taking care of me all along. She'd be there to comfort me through the trauma of discovering my wife was a murderer, and eventually I'd see that she was the love I'd been meant to find. I sat in stunned silence, processing the full scope of Michelle's delusion. She hadn't just wanted to hurt me. She'd wanted to take over my entire life, to step into the role of David's wife and partner as if I'd never existed. "David, why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I thought she was having some kind of breakdown. Because I felt sorry for her and thought I could handle it quietly without hurting you or causing family drama. Because I never imagined she'd actually try to." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Because he'd never imagined that Michelle would try to murder him to get what she wanted. None of us had imagined that level of calculating evil from someone we'd loved and trusted. That evening, I called Dr. Martinez to thank her again for believing in my innocence when everyone else was ready to convict me. She listened patiently as I told her about Michelle's confession of love for David, about the true motive behind the poisoning scheme. "Mrs. Patterson, what your sister did goes beyond simple jealousy or even obsession. She created an elaborate plan that required her to harm someone she claimed to love in order to frame someone she was supposed to protect. That level of manipulation and violence suggests a profound disconnect from reality and moral reasoning. Dr. Martinez, how do I move forward from this? How do David and I rebuild our lives when my own sister tried to destroy everything we'd built together?" "You take it one day at a time. You get counseling, both individually and as a couple. You remember that Michelle's actions say nothing about your worth or your marriage's strength. And you use this experience to build an even stronger foundation based on complete honesty and trust." The next morning brought a call from the district attorney's office. Michelle had decided to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of 25 years without the possibility of parole for 15 years. She would spend the prime years of her life in prison, and when she was finally released, she'd be a middle-aged woman with no family, no support system, and no chance of rebuilding the life she'd destroyed in her quest to steal mine. I should have felt satisfaction at the news, but instead I felt hollow. This was my sister, the little girl I'd protected and supported my entire life. Somewhere along the way, that little girl had become a monster, and I'd never seen it happening. David and I attended family counseling together that week, sitting in Dr. Thompson's office and trying to articulate the damage that had been done to our relationship. My parents were there too, both of them struggling with their own guilt over believing Michelle's lies about me. "Julia, I don't know how to apologize for doubting you," Mom said, tears streaming down her face. "You're my daughter, and I should have known you could never hurt anyone, especially not David." Dad sat quietly for most of the session, but when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who'd spent weeks questioning everything he thought he knew about his children. "Michelle fooled all of us. She used our love for both of you against us, and she nearly destroyed this family in the process. Julia, I need you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the fact that I suspected you of something so horrible." The therapist guided us through exercises designed to rebuild trust and communication, but I knew the real healing would take much longer than a few counseling sessions. Michelle had planted landmines throughout our family relationships, and we'd be discovering the damage for months or even years to come. That weekend, David and I decided to take a trip away from Riverside, away from the reminders of what we'd endured. We drove up the coast to a small bed and breakfast in Mendocino, a place where we could walk on the beach and talk without the weight of recent trauma pressing down on us. On Saturday morning, as we sat on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, David took my hand and asked the question I'd been dreading. "Julia, do you think you can ever truly forgive me for doubting you?" I looked out at the endless water, thinking about forgiveness and trust and the difference between the two. Forgiveness was a choice I could make, a decision to let go of anger and resentment for both our sakes. But trust was something that would have to be rebuilt slowly, carefully, with consistent actions over time. "David, I forgive you. I understand why you doubted me when Michelle was so skilled at manipulation, but I need you to understand that forgiveness doesn't automatically restore trust. We're going to have to work to rebuild that foundation." He nodded, accepting the challenge. "What do you need from me?" "Complete transparency. No more protecting me from difficult conversations or uncomfortable truths. If someone tries to manipulate you again, I need you to come to me immediately, instead of trying to handle it alone. And I need you to choose us, choose our marriage, even when other people are telling you I'm not worth choosing." We spent the rest of the weekend making plans for our future. David wanted to sell our house and start fresh somewhere new, away from the memories of Michelle's betrayal. I wanted to stay and reclaim our space, to prove that we were stronger than what had tried to destroy us. In the end, we decided to renovate, instead of relocate. We'd tear out the kitchen where David had collapsed and rebuild it into something completely different. We'd replace the furniture Michelle had sat on while spinning her lies. We'd create new traditions and new memories that would overshadow the darkness she'd brought into our lives. On our last night at the bed and breakfast, as we lay in bed listening to the ocean waves crash against the rocks below, David asked me another question that had been weighing on him. "Julia, do you think Michelle always hated you? Or do you think something changed along the way?" I'd been wondering the same thing. When had my little sister's normal sibling rivalry turned into something murderous? When had her jealousy become so consuming that she was willing to kill to get what she wanted? I think Michelle always struggled with the fact that I was older, that I achieved things before she did, that I seemed to find my path more easily. But I think the hatred, the real poison, started when I found David. When she realized that I'd found something she wanted and couldn't have. David was quiet for a moment. "She told me once that you'd always been everyone's favorite, that our parents loved you more because you were successful and responsible. She said she'd spent her whole life trying to prove she was just as worthy of love and attention." The sadness in his voice matched what I was feeling. Michelle's crimes were unforgivable, but the pain that had driven her to commit them was tragically human. She'd let her insecurities and jealousy consume her until she'd become someone capable of attempted murder and elaborate deception. "Maybe if I'd been a better sister," I said quietly. "Maybe if I'd paid more attention to how she was feeling, helped her find her own path instead of just cleaning up her messes. David turned to face me in the darkness. Julia, you can't blame yourself for what Michelle chose to do. You loved her and supported her your entire life. She made the decision to respond to her pain by trying to destroy you. I knew he was right, but the guilt would probably always be there. The knowledge that my happiness had triggered such darkness in someone I loved, someone I'd tried to protect and nurture throughout our childhood. As we drove back to Riverside the next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I was going to visit Michelle in jail, not to forgive her or to try to repair our relationship, but to understand, to look her in the eye and ask her how it had come to this, how love had turned to hate so completely that she'd been willing to commit murder. David tried to talk me out of it, concerned about what seeing Michelle might do to my emotional healing. But I needed closure that could only come from facing my sister one last time, from seeing who she really was beneath the mask she'd worn my entire life. The decision felt like taking control of my narrative for the first time since this nightmare began. I'd been reactive, defensive, constantly responding to Michelle's moves instead of making my own. Now I was choosing to confront the truth head-on, to walk into that jail and demand answers from the person who'd tried to steal my life. It wouldn't be easy, and it probably wouldn't give me the satisfaction I was hoping for. But it was my choice to make, my path to walk, and my way of reclaiming the power that Michelle had tried so hard to take away from me. The Riverside County jail looked exactly like what it was, a fortress designed to keep dangerous people away from society. As I sat in my car in the visitor parking lot, staring at the concrete walls and razor wire, I questioned my decision to come here for the 100th time. But I needed answers that only Michelle could provide, and I needed to look her in the eye when she gave them to me. The visiting process was dehumanizing by design. Metal detectors, background checks, forms to fill out in triplicate. I sat in a sterile waiting room with other visitors, wives clutching tissues, elderly parents looking bewildered, children who didn't understand why Daddy lived behind glass now. This was Michelle's world now, and she'd chosen it by trying to destroy mine. When they finally called my name, I followed a corrections officer down a hallway that smelled like disinfectant and despair. The visiting room was divided by thick plexiglass with phones on either side, just like in the movies, but somehow more depressing in reality. Michelle looked smaller than I remembered, wearing an orange jumpsuit that washed out her complexion and made her look like a ghost of herself. Her hair, always perfectly styled, hung limp around her face. But her eyes were the same, sharp, calculating, unrepentant. I picked up the phone on my side of the glass, and she did the same. For a moment, we just stared at each other, two sisters separated by more than just plexiglass. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Michelle said finally. Her voice sounded different through the phone, hollow and distant. "I wasn't sure I would either, but I needed to see you, to understand how we got here." Michelle laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to understand? You want me to explain why I tried to take the one thing you thought you could keep? From me?" "I never tried to keep David from you, Michelle. He was never yours to take." "Wasn't he?" Her voice sharpened with an edge I'd never heard before. "From the moment you brought him home, parading him around like a trophy, showing everyone how perfect your perfect life was. You had everything, Julia. The career, the respect, Mom and Dad's approval. Did you really think you deserved love too?" The casual cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. This wasn't the sister I'd grown up with, the one I'd protected and defended and loved unconditionally. This was a stranger wearing Michelle's face, speaking words that revealed depths of hatred I'd never suspected. "Michelle, I never tried to compete with you. I never tried to make you feel less than worthy of love. You didn't have to try. You just existed. And that was enough to remind everyone that I was the disappointment. The one who dropped out of college, who couldn't keep a job, who couldn't keep a man. And then you found David, and it was like you were rubbing my face in everything I'd never have. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the visiting room. Michelle had been carrying this resentment for years, nursing it like a wound she refused to let heal. So you decided to poison him? To frame me for attempted murder? Michelle, you could have killed David with what you were doing to him. Her expression didn't change. I was very careful with the dosages. I researched everything thoroughly. David was never in any real danger of dying, just enough danger to require medical attention that would reveal the poisoning. The clinical way she discussed nearly murdering my husband made my stomach turn. She'd planned this with the precision of a scientist conducting an experiment, except the variables were our lives, and the hypothesis was that she deserved my happiness more than I did. But you were willing to let me go to prison for something. You did. Prison wouldn't have been forever. You would have gotten out eventually, and by then David would have realized that I was the one who really cared about him. I was the one who took care of him when he was sick, who listened to his concerns about you, who was there for him when you were too busy with your precious job to notice he was suffering. The delusion was staggering. Michelle had created David's suffering and then positioned herself as his caretaker, all while planning to frame me for her crimes. In her twisted logic, this made her the victim and me the villain. Michelle, David loves me. Even if your plan had worked, even if I'd gone to prison, he never would have chosen you. He would have been devastated and traumatized, not grateful. You don't know that, she snapped. You don't know what would have happened if things had gone differently. People fall in love with their caregivers all the time. Stockholm Syndrome, trauma bonding, whatever you want to call it. I would have been there for him through the worst experience of his life, and eventually he would have seen that I was the better choice. I stared at my sister through the plexiglass, searching for any trace of the person I'd once loved. But Michelle was gone, replaced by someone who could justify attempted murder as an act of love. What about our family? What about Mom and Dad? Did you think about what this would do to them? For the first time, Michelle's composure cracked slightly. They would have understood eventually. When they saw how happy David and I were together, when they realized that you and he were never really compatible anyway. Michelle, they're devastated. Dad blames himself for not seeing who you really were. Mom cries herself to sleep every night thinking about how she failed both of us. They'll get over it. People are resilient. The casual dismissal of our parents' pain was the final confirmation that Michelle was beyond redemption. She'd been willing to sacrifice everyone who loved her for a fantasy that existed only in her own mind. I was about to hang up when Michelle leaned forward, pressing her hand against the glass. Julia, wait. There's something else you need to know. Against my better judgment, I stayed on the line. This wasn't the first time I tried to break you up. Do you remember when David got that job offer in Seattle right after you got engaged? My blood went cold. David had received an offer from a prestigious architecture firm in Seattle, a dream job that would have meant relocating across the country. He'd turned it down without much consideration, saying he wanted to build his career in California near our families. What did you do? I may have mentioned to the hiring manager that David's fiancée was very controlling and possessive, that she'd probably make his life miserable if he took a job that required travel or long hours. I may have suggested that he seemed unhappy, but was too committed to his relationship to admit it. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Michelle had been sabotaging my relationship with David from the very beginning, poisoning wells I didn't even know existed. And the food poisoning at your birthday party last year? Michelle smiled, and for a moment she looked like her old self. Ipecac in your wine, just enough to make you sick and embarrass yourself in front of David's colleagues. I thought if he saw you at your worst, he might start questioning whether you were really as perfect as he thought. Each revelation was another knife in my back, another betrayal to process. My sister had been waging a secret war against my happiness for years, and I'd been completely oblivious to it. Why are you telling me this now? Because I want you to know that even if I'm in here, even if I lost this round, I've been part of your relationship from the beginning. Every fight you and David ever had, every moment of doubt or insecurity, I had a hand in creating. You'll never know how much of your marriage is real and how much is just the result of my influence. It was her final act of cruelty, designed to poison my relationship with David even from behind bars. Michelle couldn't have my husband, so she wanted to make sure I could never fully trust the love we shared. I hung up the phone without another word and walked out of that prison knowing I'd never see my sister again. Not because she was behind bars, but because the person I'd come to see didn't exist anymore. Maybe she never had. The drive home felt like emerging from a nightmare into harsh daylight. I called David from the car, needing to hear his voice after being exposed to so much toxicity. "How did it go?" he asked gently. It was worse than I expected and exactly what I needed. "David, she told me about other things she did to us over the years, things I never suspected." I told him about the Seattle job offer, about the food poisoning at her birthday party, about all the small acts of sabotage that Michelle had orchestrated while pretending to be the supportive sister. David was quiet for a long time after I finished. "Julia, I'm so sorry. I should have seen what she was doing. I should have protected us better." Neither of us saw it because we couldn't imagine that level of deception from someone we trusted. But David, I need you to know that what Michelle said doesn't change anything between us. Our love is real, our marriage is real, and we're going to be stronger because we survived this. That evening, David and I sat down with a bottle of wine and went through our entire relationship timeline, identifying moments that now seemed suspicious in light of Michelle's confessions. It was painful but necessary, like cleaning infected wounds so they could heal properly. The next week brought unexpected vindication from a source I'd never anticipated. Dr. Martinez called to tell me that the local news station wanted to interview us about the case. Apparently, our story had captured public attention as an example of how sophisticated poisoning schemes could be and how important forensic science was in uncovering the truth. "Mrs. Patterson, I think this interview could be important not just for closure, but for education. Other people need to know that domestic poisoning cases aren't always what they seem on the surface." David and I agreed to the interview, though I was nervous about having our private trauma exposed to public scrutiny. But if our story could help other people recognize manipulation and gaslighting, maybe some good could come from the nightmare we'd endured. The interview was scheduled to take place at our home, which felt appropriate. This was where the crime had occurred, where our marriage had nearly been destroyed, and where we were now rebuilding our lives. Sarah Chen, the investigative reporter, arrived with a small crew and an approach that was both professional and compassionate. She'd clearly done her research and understood the complexity of what had happened to us. "Julia, when you first realized your husband was being poisoned and you were the primary suspect, what went through your mind?" I thought back to those terrifying early days when everything I'd built was crumbling around me. I felt like I was living in someone else's nightmare. The person I loved most in the world was suffering, and everyone I trusted was convinced I was responsible. It was like watching your entire life be rewritten by someone else. "David, how difficult was it to process that your sister-in-law had not only poisoned you, but manipulated you into doubting your wife?" David's jaw tightened as he considered the question. The betrayal was almost worse than the poisoning. Michelle didn't just attack my body. She attacked my ability to trust my own perceptions and feelings. She made me doubt the person I love most, and that's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. Sarah turned to both of us. "What would you want people to know about recognizing this kind of manipulation?" I leaned forward, thinking about all the warning signs we'd missed. "Trust your instincts about the people you love. If someone is constantly planting seeds of doubt about your relationships, ask yourself why. And remember that people who truly care about you don't try to isolate you from your support systems or make you question your own judgment. The interview continued for over an hour, covering everything from the forensic evidence that had cleared my name to the psychological impact of discovering that a family member was capable of such calculated violence. When Sarah asked about Michelle's motives, David and I exchanged glances. We'd agreed beforehand to be honest about what we'd learned without being gratuitously cruel about someone who was already facing the consequences of her actions. Michelle was in love with David and convinced herself that she deserved the life I had, I said carefully. She couldn't accept that the person she wanted didn't want her back, so she decided to eliminate what she saw as the obstacle to her happiness. How are you both healing from this experience? David reached over and took my hand. We're in counseling, both individually and together. We're learning to communicate more openly and to trust each other even when outside forces try to drive us apart, and we're focusing on building something stronger than what we had before. After the crew left, David and I sat on our couch feeling emotionally drained, but somehow lighter. Telling our story publicly had been cathartic in a way I hadn't expected. For months, we'd been the victims of someone else's narrative, powerless to control how events unfolded. Now we were reclaiming our story and sharing it on our own terms. The interview aired the following week, and the response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people reached out to share their own experiences with family manipulation and domestic abuse. Many said our story had helped them recognize red flags in their own relationships. Dr. Martinez called after the broadcast aired. Julia, I've gotten calls from law enforcement agencies in 3 different states asking for guidance on similar cases. Your willingness to speak publicly about this is already helping other victims. The vindication felt different than I'd expected. It wasn't the dramatic moment of justice I'd imagined, but rather a quiet acknowledgement that the truth had prevailed and might help prevent others from enduring what we'd been through. A few days later, I received a call from the district attorney's office. Michelle wanted to make a statement as part of her plea agreement, and they wondered if David and I wanted to attend the hearing. We decided to go, not because we needed to hear Michelle's excuses, but because we wanted to witness the final chapter of this ordeal. We wanted to see justice served and know that Michelle would face consequences for her actions. The courtroom was nearly empty except for court personnel, a few reporters, and our small group. Michelle looked even smaller in her orange jumpsuit, flanked by public defenders who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, Michelle stood slowly and turned to face David and me directly. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not for loving David because I can't help that, but for trying to hurt him and for trying to destroy Julia's life. I let my feelings become something poisonous, and I poisoned everyone around me." It was the closest thing to genuine remorse I'd heard from her, but it felt too little, too late. The damage had been done, lives had been forever changed, and sorry wasn't enough to undo any of it. The judge sentenced Michelle to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15. As the bailiff led her away in handcuffs, she looked back at us one last time. I saw something in her eyes that might have been regret or might have been anger that her plan had failed. I would never know which, and I realized I didn't care anymore. Walking out of that courthouse with David, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but the calm that comes after a storm has passed, and you realize you're still standing. The ordeal was over. Michelle would spend the next decade and a half in prison, and David and I would spend that time rebuilding our marriage and our lives. We'd been tested in ways we never could have imagined, and we'd survived with our love intact. That night, as we lay in bed, in our renovated bedroom, David asked me the question that had been haunting both of us. "Do you think we'll ever really get past this?" I thought about everything we'd endured and everything we'd learned about ourselves and each other. I think we'll get past it by going through it, not around it. We'll carry the scars, but they'll remind us how strong we are and how much we mean to each other. Outside our window, the lights of Riverside twinkled in the darkness, and I felt grateful for the ordinary life we were building together. It wasn't the fairy tale I'd once imagined, but it was real and it was ours. And no one could take that away from us ever again. Part 5. The Transformation and New Beginning. 6 months after Michelle's sentencing, I stood in the doorway of what used to be our guest bedroom, now transformed into my home office. Sunlight streamed through the new bay window David had installed, illuminating the desk where I'd been writing my victim impact statement for other court cases. Dr. Martinez had connected me with prosecutors across the state who were dealing with similar domestic poisoning cases, and my experience had become a template for understanding how these crimes unfold. The irony wasn't lost on me that Michelle's attempt to destroy my life had actually given it new purpose. What she'd intended, as my downfall had become my platform for helping others recognize the signs of systematic manipulation and abuse within families. David appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, a ritual we'd established during our recovery. Every morning, we sat together and talked about our plans for the day, our feelings about our progress, and any concerns we needed to address. It was a simple practice, but it had become the foundation of our rebuilt marriage. "The Hendersons confirmed for this afternoon," he said, settling into the comfortable reading chair we'd placed by the window. Maria sounded nervous but determined. Maria Henderson was the latest person to reach out after seeing our television interview. Her sister-in-law had been bringing meals to her husband for months while expressing concern about Maria's mental health and parenting abilities. When her husband started experiencing unexplained illness, Maria remembered our story and insisted on toxicology testing, despite family pressure to accept a diagnosis of stress-related symptoms. The tests had revealed trace amounts of sedatives in her husband's system, and now Maria was facing the same nightmare of suspicion and family betrayal that I'd endured. The difference was that she'd recognized the pattern early enough to prevent the full escalation of the scheme. "How do you feel about doing another consultation?" David asked, studying my face for signs of the emotional fatigue that sometimes followed these sessions. "Necessary," I said simply. "If I can help even one person avoid what we went through, it's worth revisiting the pain." David nodded, understanding better than anyone the complex emotions involved in helping other victims. He'd become my partner in this unexpected advocacy work, offering the perspective of someone who'd been manipulated and poisoned while providing support for the family members who struggled to believe their loved ones were capable of such betrayal. The work wasn't easy, but it had given both of us a sense of purpose that extended beyond our personal healing. We'd discovered that our trauma could be transformed into something meaningful, something that protected other families from the devastation we'd experienced. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. She'd been attending therapy sessions with Dad, working through their own guilt and confusion about Michelle's crimes. The healing process for our family was slower and more complicated than what David and I were experiencing, but there were signs of progress. "Your father wants to have dinner Sunday," I read aloud. "He says he has something he needs to tell us." David raised an eyebrow. "Good something or difficult something?" "With my family, it's hard to predict anymore. The relationship with my parents had been one of the most challenging aspects of recovery. They were devastated by their failure to recognize Michelle's manipulation and their willingness to suspect me of attempting murder. The guilt was eating them alive, but their efforts to atone sometimes felt overwhelming rather than healing. Mom had thrown herself into supporting my advocacy work, researching cases and connecting me with other victims. Dad had taken a more practical approach, helping David with the house renovations and taking care of financial details we'd neglected during the crisis. Both were trying to prove their loyalty and love in ways that sometimes made me feel more like a project than a daughter. "Maybe he's ready to talk about the inheritance," David suggested. Before Michelle's arrest, my parents had planned to leave their estate equally divided between their two daughters. Now, they were struggling with how to handle the situation fairly when one daughter was serving a lengthy prison sentence for attempting to murder the other daughter's husband. It was yet another way Michelle's crimes continued to ripple through our lives, creating problems and decisions that no family should have to navigate. That afternoon, Maria Henderson arrived at our house, looking exactly like I'd felt during those first terrible days after David's poisoning. Exhausted, scared, and desperately hoping someone would believe her story when the evidence seemed to point toward her guilt. Maria was a small woman in her 30s, with 2 young children and a husband who worked in construction. Her sister-in-law, Rebecca, had moved in with them temporarily after a divorce, offering to help with child care and household management, while Maria worked her nursing shifts at the local hospital. Rebecca was so helpful at first, Maria explained, clutching a tissue as she sat on our living room couch. She cooked dinner every night, helped the kids with homework, kept the house spotless. I felt guilty for being suspicious when she was doing so much for our family. David and I exchanged glances. The pattern was achingly familiar. The helpful family member who inserted themselves into the household routine while positioning themselves as indispensable to the victim they were systematically poisoning. "When did you first notice your husband getting sick?" I asked gently. "About 2 months after Rebecca moved in. He started having headaches, nausea, fatigue. At first, we thought it was just stress from the overtime he was pulling to support an extra person in the house. Rebecca kept saying he was working too hard, that I was pushing him to take on too much responsibility." The manipulation was textbook Michelle. Create the problem, then position yourself as the person who understood and cared about the victim's suffering while subtly blaming the spouse for contributing to it. What made you suspect poisoning instead of natural illness? "Your interview," Maria said quietly. "When you described how your husband's symptoms progressed and how your sister was always there with solutions and explanations, it was like watching my own life played back to me. I realized that Rebecca was always the one suggesting remedies, always the one bringing Steve special meals when he felt too sick to eat regular food. Maria had convinced her husband to get toxicology testing despite Rebecca's protests that he was just being dramatic about normal work-related stress. When the tests revealed sedatives in his system, Rebecca had immediately suggested that Maria must have been giving them to him without his knowledge. "The worst part," Maria continued, "is that Steve believed her at first. Rebecca had been telling him for weeks that I seemed overwhelmed and stressed, that she was worried about my ability to handle work and family responsibilities. When the drugs showed up in his system, his first thought was that I'd been medicating him to make my life easier." David leaned forward. "How did you convince him to consider other possibilities?" "I showed him your interview. I made him watch the part where you talked about how manipulation works gradually, how the abuser positions themselves as the victim's protector while isolating them from their real support system. He started remembering conversations with Rebecca differently, started questioning why she always seemed to know exactly what to say to make him doubt me. We spent 2 hours with Maria, walking through the evidence collection process, discussing legal options, and preparing her for the family trauma that would inevitably follow if she pursued charges against Rebecca. It was emotionally draining work, but seeing the relief in Maria's eyes when she realized she wasn't alone made every difficult moment worthwhile. After Maria left, David and I sat quietly in our living room, processing the session and our own continued healing. These consultations always brought back memories of our darkest days, but they also reminded us how far we'd come. "I keep thinking about how close we came to losing everything," David said, reaching for my hand. "If Dr. Martinez hadn't been thorough enough to notice the inconsistencies, if she'd just accepted the obvious explanation." "We can't live in the what-ifs," I reminded him, though I understood the feeling completely. "We survived, we're stronger, and we're helping other people survive too." Sunday dinner with my parents was held at their house. The same dining room where Michelle had convinced them to doubt my innocence during David's hospitalization. The setting carried weight, but it also represented our family's commitment to reclaiming spaces that held painful memories. Dad looked older than his 65 years, the stress of the past months having carved new lines around his eyes and mouth. Mom bustled around the kitchen with nervous energy, preparing far more food than 4 people could possibly eat. "Julia, David, thank you for coming," Dad said as we settled around the table. "I know these family dinners haven't been easy since everything happened." That was my father's way of referring to Michelle's crimes without actually saying the words. He still struggled to verbalize what his younger daughter had done, as if speaking it aloud would make it more real. "Dad, you said you had something you needed to tell us," I prompted gently. He took a deep breath and reached for a manila envelope that had been sitting on the sideboard. "Your mother and I have been working with our attorney to revise our will and estate planning. We wanted to discuss the changes with you before finalizing anything." The conversation I'd been dreading had finally arrived. How do you divide an inheritance fairly when one beneficiary is in prison for attempting to murder the other beneficiary's spouse? "We've decided to set up a trust for Michelle that will provide for her basic needs when she's released from prison," Dad continued. "Healthcare, housing assistance, job training if she wants it. But the majority of our estate will go to you, Julia." I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that my parents weren't trying to pretend Michelle's crimes hadn't happened, but also sadness that our family had been reduced to discussing how to financially handle a daughter's incarceration. "We know this might seem unfair to some people," Mom added quietly. "Michelle is still our daughter, and we can't just abandon her completely. But we also can't ignore what she did to you and David." David squeezed my hand under the table. "We understand. You're trying to balance love with justice, and that's not an easy position to be in." "There's something else," Dad said, his voice even more serious. "We want to establish a foundation in your name, Julia, something that provides support for victims of family-based poisoning and manipulation. Your advocacy work has shown us how much need there is for this kind of help." The proposal was unexpected and overwhelming. My parents wanted to create something permanent and meaningful from the trauma Michelle had inflicted on our family. "Mom, Dad, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," Mom replied. "We've already spoken with Dr. Martinez about the forensic science component and with Detective Rodriguez about the law enforcement training aspects. This could be something that really makes a difference." On the drive home, David and I discussed the foundation proposal and what it would mean for our future. The idea of turning our experience into a lasting resource for other families was appealing, but it would also mean maintaining a permanent connection to the worst period of our lives. "What do you think?" David asked as we pulled into our driveway. "I think it's what Michelle would hate most," I said, surprising myself with the honesty of the response. "She tried to destroy our lives, and instead we're building something that will help people for generations." David smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from him all day. "Then I think we should do it." That evening, we sat in our renovated kitchen and made a list of what the foundation might accomplish. Forensic science education for law enforcement. Support groups for families affected by domestic poisoning. Training materials for medical professionals to recognize the signs of systematic poisoning. Legal advocacy for victims who face suspicion instead of support. It was ambitious and overwhelming, and exactly what I needed to move fully forward from the trauma Michelle had caused. Instead of just surviving what she'd done to us, we would transform it into something that protected other families. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from Michelle. It was the first communication I'd had from her since our jail visit, and I almost threw it away without reading it. But curiosity won, and I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The letter was short and written in Michelle's familiar handwriting, though the words seemed to come from a stranger. "Julia, I heard about the foundation from Mom. I want you to know that I think it's a good thing. I can't undo what I did, and I can't take back the pain I caused. But maybe if other people learn from my mistakes, some good can come from this nightmare. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I'm proud of what you're building from the ashes of what I destroyed. Love, Michelle. I read the letter 3 times, searching for hidden meanings or manipulation. But it seemed genuine in a way that Michelle's previous communications hadn't been. Maybe prison was changing her, or maybe she'd finally faced the full scope of what she'd done. I showed the letter to David, who read it thoughtfully before handing it back. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think it doesn't change anything, but it might be the beginning of Michelle taking real responsibility for her actions." I folded the letter and put it away in the file I kept of documents related to the case. I wasn't ready to forgive Michelle, and I might never be. But her acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused felt like another step toward closure. 6 months later, the Julia Patterson Foundation for Family Safety held its first annual conference. The conference center was filled with law enforcement officers, medical professionals, family advocates, and survivors of domestic poisoning cases. Dr. Martinez gave the keynote address about advances in forensic toxicology and the importance of thorough investigation in suspected poisoning cases. Detective Rodriguez led a workshop on recognizing manipulation patterns in family-based crimes. David and I facilitated support groups for couples who were rebuilding their relationships after traumatic betrayals. During the lunch break, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm Emily Chen. My mother saw your interview and recognized what my stepfather was doing to my dad. Because of your story, we got help before it was too late." These moments made every difficult day of advocacy work worthwhile. Michelle had tried to poison my husband and destroy my family, but instead she'd inadvertently created a network of support and protection for other families facing similar threats. That evening, David and I returned home exhausted but fulfilled. The foundation was already planning its second conference and had received grants to fund research into domestic poisoning patterns. What had started as our personal nightmare was becoming a force for positive change. As we sat on our back patio watching the sunset over Riverside, David asked the question that had been on both our minds all day. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Michelle had succeeded?" I thought about it seriously before answering. I think about it sometimes, but not with regret. I think about it with gratitude that we survived, and with determination to make sure other families don't have to face what we faced. David nodded, understanding the complex emotions involved in moving forward from such a profound betrayal. "I love you, Julia. Not just for who you were before this happened, but for who you've become because of it." "I love you too. And I love the life we've built together, even if it's not the life we originally planned." Our marriage was different now than it had been before Michelle's poisoning scheme. It was more intentional, more honest, more grounded in reality than in romantic ideals. We'd learned that love wasn't just about feeling good together. It was about choosing each other even when outside forces tried to drive us apart. 2 years after Michelle's sentencing, I received a call from her prison counselor. Michelle was up for a psychological evaluation that could affect her parole eligibility, and she'd requested that I write a victim impact statement for her file. I spent weeks wrestling with what to write. Part of me wanted to ensure that Michelle served her full sentence, to make sure she faced the maximum consequences for her crimes, but another part of me recognized that holding on to anger was only hurting myself. In the end, I wrote honestly about the impact of Michelle's crimes on my life, my marriage, and my family. I described the trauma we'd endured and the long process of healing we'd undertaken. But I also wrote about the positive changes that had emerged from our experience, the foundation we'd built, and the families we'd helped. I didn't recommend early parole for Michelle, but I didn't argue against it either. I simply told the truth about how her actions had affected us and left the decision to the parole board. Michelle was ultimately denied early release, But the psychological evaluation noted significant progress in her understanding of the harm she'd caused and her commitment to making amends when possible. 5 years after the poisoning, David and I celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary with a small party in our backyard. The guest list was carefully curated to include only people who had supported us through the darkest period of our lives. Dr. Martinez was there with her husband, still working on forensic cases but now also serving on the Foundation's scientific advisory board. Detective Rodriguez attended with her wife, having been promoted to sergeant, partly due to her excellent work on our case. My parents came, looking healthier and happier than they had in years. Notably absent was any representative. From Michelle's side of the family, the few relatives who had initially supported her had gradually distanced themselves as the full scope of her crimes became clear. As the evening wound down and our guests began to leave, David and I found ourselves alone in our garden, surrounded by the flowers and herbs we'd planted together as part of our healing process. 10 years, David said, pulling me close. Not all of them easy, but all of them worth it. Here's to 10 more, I replied, raising my wine glass in a toast. And to the truth always finding a way to surface, no matter how deeply someone tries. To bury it. We stood together in our garden, surrounded by the life we'd built and rebuilt and built again, stronger each time. Michelle had tried to poison more than just David's body. She'd tried to poison our love, our trust, our future together. She'd failed completely. What she'd intended as our ending had become our beginning. The foundation continued to grow, helping dozens of families each year. Our marriage had evolved into something deeper and more resilient than we'd ever imagined possible. Even my relationship with my parents had strengthened as we'd worked together to heal from the trauma Michelle had inflicted on all of us. Sometimes, I wondered if Michelle, sitting in her prison cell, understood that her attempt to destroy my happiness had actually led to the most meaningful and purposeful period of my life. Probably not, and maybe that was for the best. Some people never learn to find joy in others' success, even when that success comes partly from surviving their betrayal. But I'd learned something Michelle never understood, that true happiness doesn't come from taking someone else's life or love. It comes from building something worthwhile with the person you choose, from surviving challenges together, and from using your experiences to help other people facing similar struggles. As David and I walked hand in hand toward our house, felt grateful for every choice that had led us to this moment. Even the painful ones, even the ones that had nearly destroyed us, because they'd ultimately shown us how strong our love really was. The lights of Riverside twinkled around us, and somewhere in those lights were families like the Hendersons, people who'd recognized danger early because of our story and gotten help before it was too late. That knowledge made every difficult day of our journey worthwhile. Michelle had planted poison in our lives, but we'd grown something beautiful from the contaminated soil. And that, more than any legal victory or public vindication, was the real triumph over what she'd tried to do to us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.